Welcome, everybody, to the latest episode of The American Founding. This is a podcast about early American history, political philosophy, and the United States Constitution. It is brought to you by the Institute for Faith and Freedom at Grove City College. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Grove City, which ranks among the best colleges and universities in both Pennsylvania and the United States. Grove City College fosters intellectual, moral, spiritual, and social development consistent with a Christian worldview. It advocates individual liberty, individual freedom, personal responsibility, and seeks to preserve America's political, economic, and religious heritage. Grove City College is one of the few truly independent colleges in the nation. It accepts no federal funding, including federal student aid. This allows it to operate free of government interference or political influence. And as always, you can learn more at faithandfreedom.com. All right, well, welcome back. Last episode, I entitled Novus Ordo Seclorum, after the slogan on the reverse side of the Great Seal, which means the New Order of the Ages, and discussed how the Constitution, when taken in conjunction with the Declaration of Independence, represents and has come to represent, and indeed is, a new order of the ages. However, this is something that we can appreciate only in historical retrospect. There was a little bit after the Constitution was signed on September 17th, there was a little bit of spiking of the football among the delegates, but it didn't last very long. And what happens very, very quickly is a vigorous and closely contested fight for ratification. One that very easily could have gone in another direction. And we're going to talk over the next couple of episodes about this battle over ratification. And tonight's episode really sort of introduces that by looking particularly at George Mason of Virginia. We're going to look at Mason, who he was, why he was important, why it was a big deal that George Mason would oppose the Constitution. So to start, I have this quotation, this personal memorandum that Alexander Hamilton wrote around the time that the Constitution was signed, so middle of September. And he was sort of weighing the pluses and minuses of it, and the first thing that he mentioned in its favor, he wrote, quote, "The new Constitution has in its favor of its success these circumstances." The first one being, quote, "a very great weight of influence of the persons who framed it, particularly in the universal popularity of General Washington." Now, this is true. And it's not just the socioeconomic status of the framers, although that is certainly part of it. The Constitution generally was supported by what we would probably call the middle and upper classes of American society, people with a stake in society. But was particularly supported by the commercial classes in the eastern cities. So overwhelming support in Philadelphia, which we're going to see in a subsequent episode, really ends up being a significant factor in its favor. Related to this is, frankly, the Constitution had, in general, better minds working on its behalf than those against in most states. And you can sort of see this in the Federalist essays, which will, again, be a subject of a later episode. The Federalist essays were written specifically to make the case for ratification. But they are such excellent pieces of political philosophy, literature, whatever you want to call it, that they remain important to read. And they remain impressive to read as well. They're very, very well done. And while there are some essayists on the anti-federal side who are pretty good, the person who writes the Brutus essays, for instance, pretty good. But there's really nobody working at the same level as James Madison and Alexander Hamilton are on behalf of the anti-federal cause. And it's just that the way this shook out was, for the most part, generally speaking, the best and the brightest were in favor of the Constitution. However, that is not true in the Commonwealth of Virginia. The Commonwealth of Virginia, the men of weight, the men of esteem, are more evenly divided. Obviously, you have George Washington on one hand. However, on the other hand, you have Richard Henry Lee, you have Patrick Henry, you have George Mason, Thomas Jefferson is in France and frankly is a little wishy-washy on this. And so it's the Virginia political class that is much more evenly divided. The New York political class was also more evenly divided. So these two states stand out. And among the Virginia Anti-Federalists, the first one to really talk about is George Mason. George Mason is a very important figure in the history of the American Revolution. And I'm going to argue tonight that he can be thought of as the first Anti-Federalist, in that he sought to make public his reasons for opposition. And so it's important to understand exactly what he thought, and to appreciate the fact that he publicly opposed the Constitution was in itself a big deal because he was widely respected, at least in Virginia. So, our agenda for this episode. The first, a little background on who George Mason is, especially his major contribution, which is the Virginia Declaration of Rights. Then we're going to look at why George Mason opposed the Constitution, and bear in mind that Mason, as we go through this, Mason is a delegate from Virginia. And for most of the convention, Mason is an active and constructive participant in the proceedings. As a matter of fact, if you look at who the top 5 contributors to the debates in the Constitutional Convention were, Mason's in the top 5. It's Gouverneur Morris, James Madison, James Wilson of Pennsylvania, Mason and Randolph. And Randolph and Mason are constructive participants, but ultimately end up opposing the Constitution. That's a big deal. And so we're going to have to look at, well, why did he oppose the Constitution? And from that, we can get a sense of why he's the first Anti-Federalist. And as I mentioned a moment ago, one of the reasons he's the first Anti-Federalist is because he makes his opposition public. There's another reason as well. Mason anticipates the general themes and arguments of the Anti-Federalists. And what I want to highlight in this episode is that Mason's criticism of the Constitution is coming from within the same basic political assumptions as the Federalists. This is not a disagreement between, say, the Whigs and the Tories in England in the 17th century. These guys on both sides of this question agree on the basic fundamental assumptions about popular sovereignty, about the importance of private property, about the importance of balancing power, Republican ideas. Their disagreements are really very second order and really sort of get into whether or not the Constitution will advance the values that they all hold. The fourth thing we're going to touch on briefly is the kind of it's a question of, maybe you could call it an existential question or an ontological question. Is George Mason actually a founding father? I'm going to argue that he is, but you can argue either way. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Mason and his biography. And you can get a sense of Mason from just the titles of the 3, in the last 50 years, the 3 biggest biographies. One was called Reluctant Statesman, one was called Gentleman Revolutionary, and one was called Forgotten Founder. That adds up to a pretty good summary of his life, like 3 bullet points. Mason was, in a lot of respects, the prototype Virginia gentleman. And he, in that capacity, argued, as well as anybody in the Old Dominion, the Republican vision of the planter class. But he was consistently reluctant to get involved in the political process, which makes him very different than James Madison, who was eager and involved and actively engaged in sort of politics was Madison's vocation. Also different than Jefferson, who would often talk about, I need to get out of this. Politics is too much for me. I don't want to do this, but would always be drawn back. Mason really checks out. He does that a lot. Another thing I would note about Mason is to appreciate when he was born, to appreciate the generational differences, because there is a pretty big generational divide here, or maybe not generational divide, but there is a breadth here of individuals. So, for instance, Alexander Hamilton was born in 1758. So was James Monroe. Monroe might have been 59, I don't remember. Madison was 1751. Thomas Jefferson, 1743. John Adams is 1735. George Washington is 1732. George Mason is 1725. So Mason really is old enough to be not only obviously Madison's father, but even arguably Jefferson's father. So Mason's older. So Mason is born in what is known as the Northern Neck in colonial Virginia. This is an area that's between the Potomac and Rappahannock rivers. There's sort of four major rivers along the Virginia, the Tidewater region. There's the Potomac, the Rappahannock, the James, and the Charles River. I think it's the Charles and the James. There's these four rivers that sort of drain out that created all of this land that was very good for tobacco plantations. And the Northern Neck had once been owned by the Fairfax family, but by the time of Mason's birth in 1725, the land had been sort of distributed out, but then concentrated in the hands of elite planter families who are farming tobacco with lots of slaves. And this is the place where, for instance, so Mason and the Washingtons and the Lees are all in this area. So are the Custises, Martha Custis. As a matter of fact, George Washington and George Mason are neighbors and friends. And I'll encourage you, by the way, if you ever are visiting Mount Vernon, it might be worth your while to plan in the later part of your day to just drive right down the road and visit Gunston Hall, which is George Mason's homestead. Years ago, I took my son to visit Mount Vernon, and I really wanted to go see Gunston Hall, but we went in like mid-July, and it was scorchingly hot. And my son, who was like 10 years old, he was just melted, so I've never had occasion to visit Gunston Hall, but it's supposed to be amazing. By the way, Mason has about 90 or so enslaved people on his plantation. So this is a time in the 1700s, the mid-1700s, where tobacco is starting to wear out the soil. And this is a big reason why the Monroe's plantation, Ashland, Montpelier, which is James Madison's plantation, Monticello, Jefferson's, they all end up failing because the tobacco, the crop is just so hard on the soil, and efforts to diversify are just unsuccessful. Plus, Jefferson and Madison are very profligate in their spending habits. Mason doesn't have that problem because he is a very savvy and frugal businessman. And the way to think about these plantation owners is that they really are like CEOs of large businesses where they have over 100 employees. Mason's plantation, for instance, includes a schoolhouse, a spinning house, a well house, and a blacksmith shop. And if you count the enslaved population and the white overseers, I mean, we're talking about over 100 people here. And, it's one of the problems that Jefferson and Madison, both of them have, is that while they're away doing politics, somebody else is managing their estates. And whether or not they're doing a good job at the business is, a question that ends up having to be answered when they come back into town. Mason, and we'll talk about this as well, Mason does not like to leave Gunston Hall. He does not like to leave his plantation, and he likes to keep a tight control over the business of his plantation. So Gunston Hall, which is his homestead, is built by Mason in the 1730s. It's a really gorgeous building that's still there, and if you look at it online, you can see that it's not particularly flashy. It doesn't really have the kind of, obviously, the eccentric flourishes of Monticello. It's more straightforward. Probably it's less flashy, certainly, than Mount Vernon. I'd argue less flashy than Montpelier, even with its front portico. But it is a really impressive place. Now, large landowners like Mason in colonial Virginia are expected to participate in local government, and of course Mason does. For instance, he's Justice of the Peace, and in the late 1750s, he ends up serving in the House of Burgesses, which is the forerunner to the House of Delegates. He hates it. He hates politics. He hates the endless speechifying. And one of the things about Mason in his disdain for politics is that he inherits gout in his family. So he has gout, and it's very, very difficult. Traveling is really, really a terrible experience for him. And after his stint in the House of Burgesses, he had hoped to retire to his plantation and just live out his days as a country gentleman. And bear in mind, by that point, he's in his mid-40s. But that's around the time that the crisis between the colonies and the crown really begins to happen. And Mason is not trained as a lawyer, but he's very intelligent, and he has owns, between his direct holdings, and he's got land he owns in Kentucky, far away land, he owns like 5,000 acres. And when you own that much land and you're as a careful, savvy manager as Mason, you have to understand the law. And like a lot of these colonial patriots, he interprets the dispute with the crown as a fundamentally illegal one. The idea basically being that the colonists were entitled to certain rights and privileges that the crown had either directly transgressed or had allowed Parliament to transgress it. And you see this in the Declaration of Independence, and you likewise see it in Jefferson's summary view of the rights of British colonial Britain, where the argument is that the law, the ancient Constitution, entitles us to these rights, and our rights are being violated, and we need redress of you need to make this right, King George. And in 1774, at Washington's encouragement, remember Washington and Mason are neighbors and they're friends. Mason drafts the Fairfax Resolves, which is a pretty radical document that rejects parliamentary power and is highly influential in Virginia. There's a lot of other counties in Virginia that draw up a similar set of resolutions. And the context of this is sort of in the wake of the Boston Tea Party. And so Mason had by this point established himself as one of the most preeminent revolutionary intellectuals. And the way to think about this as well is his age. So 1774, Mason would be 49 years old. So he's an established individual. In contrast, Thomas Jefferson would just be 33 years old, still much younger. James Madison would only be 23 years old. So there's an age difference there, and Mason is sort of, by virtue of his age, accorded a status within the colonial patriot movement, and he's at the top, at least within Virginia. He never quite manages to do the leapfrog and become a continental-wide figure, and a lot of that is because he just doesn't want to leave Virginia. He declines an offer to attend the Second Continental Congress in 1775, but importantly, he participates in the Virginia Convention of 1776. Now, the context of this event is that by this point, the royal governor of Virginia had already fled. There had already been skirmishes. Now, this is even before the Declaration of Independence. And it's important to bear in mind that just like as in Massachusetts, in many places, the Revolutionary War had begun before the Declaration was even written. Virginia is another one of these places. And so in the summer of 1776, as the delegates are meeting in Philadelphia to declare independence, Virginia is already, in fact, independent. They're governing themselves there. And so what they need to do, what the new Commonwealth needs to do, is write up a constitution. And so this is what this convention is. This, by the way, is James Madison's first participation in any kind of sort of substantial political event, which is this convention. Madison is just a pup at this thing. Mason is a senior figure. And one of the important contributions of this Constitution that they write in 1776 is the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which is added to the new Constitution as a kind of a preface. And Mason is the primary author of this document, which is his biggest contribution in the history of the world, frankly. Mason is the one who writes this. And I want to give you some highlights from this, and I'm going to make some observations as I do. The first section reads that all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights of which, when they enter into a state of society, they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty with the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. If that sounds like Thomas Jefferson, there's a reason for that. I'm not 100% sure. I'd have to go back and check. But I think there is a view, generally speaking, that Jefferson was aware of what Mason was up to when Jefferson himself was sitting down to write the Declaration, and that Mason is influencing Jefferson. Likewise, I'm pretty sure that it's not the other way around, that Jefferson is influenced by Mason. Obviously, Jefferson's is much more mellifluous, but the basic ideas are there in Mason's Section 1. Section 2, that all power is vested in and consequently derived from the people, that magistrates are their trustees and servants and at all times amenable to them. Section 3, that government is or ought to be instituted for the common benefit, protection, and security of the people, nation, or community. So what we have here, Mason is declaring in very, very concise, tight language the basic bullet points of what we could call liberal republicanism, which is the general Whig patriot view that ends up becoming the founding creed of the United States. That government is created by individuals who are naturally free and equal, that government derives its power from these individuals, that the purpose of government is to protect their rights, and that government exists for the common benefit. It's all right there. So to carry on, I point out Section 5. It reads that the legislative and executive powers of the state should be separate and distinct from the judiciary. So here Mason, again, just a classic Republican thinking of the period, drawing on Montesquieu, drawing on the British system, at least its ideal version, and arguing for separated powers. And then we have this section that really anticipates the Bill of Rights, and it anticipates it because, frankly, when James Madison is putting the Bill of Rights together, the obvious place to go is the Virginia Declaration of Rights. So, Section 8. In all capital or criminal prosecutions, a man has a right to demand the cause and nature of his accusation, to be confronted with the accusers and witnesses, to call for evidence in his favor, and to a speedy trial by an impartial jury of 12 men of his vicinage. Section 9. That excessive bail ought not to be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. Here Madison is drawing on the exact same language. Section 10, that general warrants whereby an officer or messenger may be commanded to search suspected places without evidence of a fact committed, or to seize any persons or persons not named, or whose offense is not particularly described and supported by evidence, are grievous and oppressive and ought not to be granted. Section 11, that in controversies respecting property and in suits between man and man, the ancient trial by jury is preferable to any other and ought to be held sacred. So down the road in this podcast, we're going to look at the Bill of Rights. And when you look at the Bill of Rights, you see Amendments 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 are your protections from the prosecutorial and judicial powers of the state. And 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 are all inspired by Mason. Now, to be clear, Mason is also drawing on a broad and rich literature in the English-speaking world, and so he himself is drawing on things like the common law and drawing on the English Declaration of Rights or the English Bill of Rights from 1689. So it's not like Mason is inventing or pulling these things out of whole cloth. That's not what he's doing here. So don't get the wrong impression about this, but still it's very significant that Mason is putting all of this together in a basically bullet points is what he's doing. Section 12, that the freedom of the press is one of the greatest bulwarks of liberty and can never be restrained but by despotic governments. Section 13, that a well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people trained to arms is the proper, natural, and safe defense of a free state. That standing armies in times of peace should be avoided as dangerous to liberty, and that in all cases the military should be under strict subordination to and governed by the civil power. So here we have an anticipation of the Second Amendment, and the sort of motivation of the Second Amendment being that the defense of the state should hinge ultimately upon the free citizens who are independently armed. But also you have here an anticipation of the idea of the president being the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. And then finally, number 16, section 16, that religion and the manner of discharging it can be directed only by reason and conviction and not by force or violence, and therefore all men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience. So Mason does not go so far in section 16 as to disestablish the Anglican Church in Virginia. Instead, he's promoting free exercise. So the Anglican Church, or soon to be named the Episcopal Church, is going to continue to be the state-sponsored church for another decade or so, but that religious toleration, or the free exercise of religion will be tolerated. Madison, who is, again, just a young fella at this convention, wants to go further, and he pushes on in committee for a complete disestablishment, but he gets voted down. But he and Jefferson end up winning that later on. Okay, so by 1776, so Mason has established himself then as being up there on the same level with guys like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson as preeminent, what I would call Whig radicals of the Revolution. This is all radical Whig in the British sense, this idea of government as a contract between the governed and the governors, that its purpose is to protect liberty, particularly the right to property, and that its actions are only for the benefit of the common good. So Mason is articulating this as clearly and concisely and with a really rich depth in the Virginia Declaration of Rights as much as anybody. And Mason's Declaration of Rights is very influential. It influences a bunch of states directly, Pennsylvania, Maryland, a couple others, but every state ends up having some kind of constitutional Declaration of Rights. And ultimately, as we'll see, it's Mason, in many respects, who ends up being responsible for the Bill of Rights. All right, so let's talk about Mason at the Constitutional Convention and how he comes to be an opponent to. Well, what's his beef with the Constitution? So the Revolution drew Mason into the business of government, but he still, would not go up to Philadelphia to attend to the Continental Congress. But the crisis by the mid-1780s being what it is, Mason's asked to go up and participate in the Constitutional Convention, so he goes. And he participates actively and constructively. It looks like Mason's going to be a yes vote. There are lots of people, not a lot of people, but there are a couple of people at the convention you can see. They're not going to vote yes. Luther Martin of Maryland is probably the quintessential example of this. He is just so far afield from where the center of the convention is that it's probably not going to happen. Elbridge Gerry is probably the same. He's just so quirky and so hard to pin down that, but Mason doesn't seem that way. In fact, Mason is kind of on the Democratic side of the spectrum. One of his initial concerns at the convention was that the northern states were becoming too skeptical of the Republican principle of majority rule. And more than a few delegates opposed popular election in the House. And Mason disagrees, and at the end of May says the House, quote, was to be the grand depository of the democratic principle of the government. It was, so to speak, to be our House of Commons. It ought to know and sympathize with every part of the committee. Mason, quote, admitted that we had been too democratic, as in the past with the state governments, but, quote, was afraid we should incautiously run into the opposite extreme. Mason likes the House. Mason also endorses and advocates for the Connecticut Compromise. He's fine with it. And again, if you read the debates in May, in June, into July, Mason definitely does not seem like somebody who's trying to gum up the works or is just hopelessly in disagreement. Now, things get a little more complicated with Mason when it comes to the slavery issue, and he ends up being really interesting in his views. He's against the 3/5 compromise. Now remember, he's not only is he a slave owner, but he owns upwards of 100 enslaved people. Nevertheless, he recognizes the evils of slavery and is particularly opposed, really particularly opposed to the continuation of the slave trade. This is Mason on August 22nd, sort of anticipating the Civil War. He says, every master of slaves is born a petty tyrant. They bring the judgment of heaven on a country. As nations cannot be rewarded or punished in the next world, they must be in this. By an inevitable chain of causes and effects, Providence punishes national sins by national calamities. In August, after the Committee of Detail produces its report. So what happens is the way the convention works is they are in what is known as the Committee of the Whole, which is really a mechanism for them to have informal debates, and they take votes on resolutions, and they may or may not revisit them. And so they finish this process, and they hand it off to the Committee of Detail. And the Committee of Detail comes back with a 23-article report on August 6th, and Mason is unhappy with it. And it really begins this sort of month-long, little more than a month, but this sort of 6-week slide into just really aggressive opposition. So what's his beat? He doesn't like the presidency. He doesn't like the design of the presidency. He wants an executive council to help the president guide his decisions, something similar to like what existed in Virginia. The absence of an executive council makes him fear that the president will be a tool of the Senate. But he also doesn't like the presidency itself. It's sort of weird. He thinks the president's going to potentially be a tool of the Senate, but he also doesn't like the idea of a unilateral executive. And he doesn't like a lot of the powers that the president has, for instance, the pardon power. He doesn't like how much power the Senate has. He doesn't like that the Senate has the ability to alter money bills. One of the aspects of the Connecticut Compromise, the Great Compromise, was that the House would originate money bills, but the Senate is allowed to alter them. Mason doesn't like that, and in fact, Mason is right in the future, is that the Senate, not only does the Senate's ability to alter money bills or bills to raise money, effectively gives it the power to write them itself, and the Senate does this all the time. They have to work from a House originated money bill, but what they'll do is they'll just take a House bill and pass an amendment that takes all of the stuff out of the House bill and puts their own idea in it. They do this all the time. The House's privilege to originate money bills is not a real power. He doesn't like that the Senate has the power to advise and consent on nominees and with treaties. He doesn't like the length of tenure. Overall, too much power and too much independence. And this sort of compounds for him because, Mason points out that in the realm of foreign affairs, the Senate and the president have an exclusive power legislation. That's what he says. And the House, which is the democratic organ in the original design, isn't even there. And so all of this leads him to this conclusion at the end. He says, quote, "This government will set out a moderate aristocracy. It is at present impossible to foresee whether it will in its operation produce a monarchy or a corrupt tyrannical aristocracy. It will most probably vibrate some years between the two and then terminate in the one or the other." So Mason's argument here is that the power divisions are badly done. Almost like the idea of, sort of a wheel that's not sort of built correctly. It'll wobble, right, and then fall over. If a perfect Republican government is one in which the wheel keeps spinning because everything is weighted precisely, Mason's argument is that the weights are wrong in this, and so it'll tip into either aristocracy or monarchy. Mason is also worried about regional rivalries. And this is where his political thought gets kind of interesting. He is anti-slavery at the Constitutional Convention. So you might be surprised, why has he got such a problem? He's worried that the Southern export economy is potentially damaged by the Northern majority, particularly in the Senate. And so Mason wants a supermajority for what are known as navigation acts that regulate trade, and he doesn't get that. In fact, Mason is outraged because the ultimate compromise they hammer out is that Georgia and South Carolina, which are the two state delegations that want a continuation of the slave trade, they abandoned their call for a two-thirds majority on trade laws and join with the northern states to get rid of that in exchange for a 20-year extension of the slave trade. And Mason is sort of doubly disgusted by this because he wants the slave trade to end. He views it as an abomination. And then on top of that, the one actually appropriate thing, which is the protection of the Southern regional economy, he doesn't get. This is another area, by the way, where Mason is farsighted because this is going to become an issue in the 1820s and the 1830s as Congress, because it has this ability to pass tariffs, is able to pass higher and higher tariff rates that are good for the West and good for the North, but are very bad for the South. And this is what ultimately leads to the nullification crisis in the 1820s and 30s. Mason, in his way, is already anticipating that there. So, farsighted. Not to say that Mason was right on this, but just to say that his anticipation is correct. And finally, and I think most significantly, what he calls a fatal objection, unsurprisingly, is the rejection of a Bill of Rights. And it's not just that the convention votes down the creation of a Bill of Rights. It's that they do so unanimously. This to him was just profoundly problematic. And I do think that in retrospect, it is the great mistake of the convention. I think they were probably tired and they didn't want to get into an extended debate about what should go into a Bill of Rights. I think that was part of it. I think that they probably thought that their purpose was not to enumerate rights and instead design a government. But this was, from Mason's perspective, you include a Bill of Rights in these sort of foundational documents as a clear, unequivocal message of the limits of government power. And this gets voted down unanimously, 10 states to 0. And it's not just this is not just symbolism for Mason. These bills of rights are, substantively important. And also, recall that the Constitution is going to be superior to the state constitutions. So there's a little legitimate concern from Mason's perspective that the Bill of Rights of the states could potentially be in jeopardy. So we go from Mason being this advocate and sort of vigorous, constructive participant in the convention to, on August 31st, he says, quote, he would sooner chop off his right hand than put it to the Constitution as it now stands, which is some pretty aggressive rhetoric. Madison tells Thomas Jefferson in October, as Jefferson is in France, isn't there, Madison is sort of giving him the inside scoop. He says, quote, Colonel Mason left Philadelphia in an exceeding ill humor indeed. No wonder. A number of little circumstances arising in part from the impatience which prevailed towards the close of the business conspired to whet his acrimony. I'll say, chop off your right hand rather than put it to the Constitution. That is certainly acrimony. So, those are Mason's grounds for objecting to the Constitution. What actually makes him the first Anti-Federalist? I would argue that the reason is that he has a list of objections that he takes public. He privately gave them to George Washington as sort of a memorandum, like this is what I don't like. But then he disseminates them, including to Richard Henry Lee. And we're going to talk about Richard Henry Lee here. Richard Henry Lee is at the Continental Congress, and so Mason almost immediately begins coordinating with Richard Henry Lee. And then he tries, we're going to talk about this as well, he tries to mobilize opponents in Pennsylvania as the supporters of the Constitution try to do a quickie ratification through Pennsylvania. Mason tries to help the opponents and help them firm up their arguments. And he ends up going to the House of Delegates to mobilize opposition there, including to Patrick Henry. So Mason, in a lot of respects, is the first one sort of spreading the word, this is a problem. This is what George Washington writes this to Madison. He says, the political tenets of Colonel Mason and Colonel Richard Henry Lee are always in unison. It may be asked which of them gives the tone, and Washington says, without hesitation, it is Mason, because Mason, quote, will receive it from no one. He has, I am informed, rendered himself obnoxious in Philadelphia by the pains he took to disseminate his objections among some of the leaders of the seceding members of the legislature of that state. And ultimately, Washington says that Mason's intent is to, quote, alarm the people. That seems to be the groundwork of his plan. So Mason is one of the first, maybe the first, and certainly the most prominent one who was in Philadelphia in September saying, let's fight this out. I don't like this Constitution, but this is not over. I want to defeat this in the ratification process. And as a consequence, Mason not only helps inspire the anti-federal movement, but forces the supporters of the Constitution, particularly Washington and Madison and Hamilton, to respond. Madison and Hamilton respond with the Federalist essays because of the proliferation of anti-federal essays in the newspapers, particularly in New York. And does all of that get back to Mason? No. Would this have happened anyway without Mason? In all likelihood, yes. But still, Mason is the first one to publicly offer an organized opposition to the Constitution. And remember, the background here is that Mason has this list of, I think it's called objections to the plan of government or something, that he publicizes. So Mason is, in a lot of respects, the first anti-federalist essayist. So another thing to bear in mind about Mason here as an anti-federalist, and also why he's the first one, is that Mason is arguing from within the mainstream of American political thought, this sort of liberal, Republican, Whiggish tradition. He has the same basic premises as a guy like James Madison about how, for instance, Republican government has to be balanced. It has to protect rights. It has to derive from its authority from the governed. He and Madison agree on all these things. The difference between them is that Madison ultimately, and we'll talk about Madison in subsequent lectures, or podcast episodes, Madison ultimately decides that the Constitution is going to be positive for this. But Mason doesn't think that. Madison ultimately decides that the Constitution will advance these basic goals. Mason does not think that it will. So Mason's objections are not that based on the fact that he's a monarchist, or that he's a small d Democrat, or that he's a small stater or a big stater. His objection is that the science of politics, which is a phrase we've discussed a lot, renders this system bad. Mason's study of politics and his understanding of how government works in practice tells him that this government will not work. And that is going to be a key aspect of the fight over the Constitution. Pretty much every figure we'll discuss was a liberal Republican, as I'm using the phrase here. Purpose of government is to protect rights, that all government decisions should be made for the common good, that power needs to be balanced. All of these attitudes are shared assumptions on both sides. Likewise, pretty much everybody is in the Enlightenment sort of realm of the science of politics. They think politics may be reduced to a science, as the Scottish philosopher David Hume put it in one of his famous essays. Challenge is that this science of politics is full of speculation. There's not a lot of data about how Republican government should function. There's a lot of history, but most of it is not directly comparable. And you can learn different lessons from different experiences, and you can make different emphases. And so the science of politics is speculative, and so that leads to a lot of disagreement. What some people think will work, other people do not. Now, ultimately, I think it's something to bear in mind here, and you can sort of pick this up in Madison's comments and also Washington's comments, is that Mason was just really in a bad mood and was really crabby. And he was bothered in ways that I don't think can be reduced to a purely intellectual disagreement. Benjamin Franklin's first choice for how the government would work were far afield from the Constitution. Franklin is farther away from the Constitution in his first choice of government than Mason is. But Franklin says yes, because I think that's sort of who Franklin is as an individual. Mason is not like Franklin, and also there's an implied sort of value here, and particularly in Madison's discussion of Mason and his ill humor, that Mason, his bad mood, he was in a lot of pain. And like when he came home from Philadelphia, his gout had gotten very bad, and he underwent some bloodletting, and it was really painful. And so I think Mason is, I don't want to reduce it to something as bitterness, but I do think that there is a psychological aspect going on here. To what extent that's involved, I don't know, but I do think you can't think about Mason's opposition, frankly, without going back to the reality that he's just an old man at this point. I mean, he's 62 years old. That's old in 1787. He's an old man, and he's traveling, and he's got gout, which is a very unpleasant disease even today if you happen to get gout. With the treatments, can you imagine having gout in 1787? So with all of this, is it fair to call George Mason a founding father? I think the answer is yes. I think it's obviously a judgment call. His refusal to sign the Constitution probably did his reputation a long-term blow. There are not a lot of books in praise of George Mason. James Madison has an endless number of biographies, of which, admittedly, I've written one. Jefferson, likewise. Look, Mason hasn't had that many written. There were only really 3 or 4 big ones in the last 50 years. And none of them were runaway bestsellers. John Meacham hasn't written a George Mason book, for instance. David McCullough never wrote a George Mason book. You get the idea here. And probably in large measure because of his opposition to the Constitution, it just is a long-term hit. Although I don't think Mason would particularly have cared. I don't think that was something he was interested in. If Mason was really chasing long-term fame and fortune, he probably would have spent more time in politics and less time managing the affairs of his estate. Still, I would argue that Mason is a founding father. I actually argue with a great degree of confidence, because I think we have to think about the founding as something more than just this period when the Constitution was written, debated, and the Bill of Rights was enacted. The founding instead is this larger period of time that extends before the Continental or the Constitutional Convention, back to the Declaration, I'd say even a little further, and forward into history. I mean, I have this podcast is called The American Founding. I'm going to want to talk about stuff that happens as late as the 1820s. So I think that when we take a broader sense of things, we have to acknowledge that the Virginia Declaration of Rights is a founding act of very, very great significance. It influences the state governments, and it becomes the most effective argument of the Anti-Federalists, because people had come to expect bills of rights in their constitutions, be it in their state constitution or their national constitution. That was an expectation, and it was an expectation because Mason, at least in part because of what Mason had done in writing the Virginia Declaration of Rights. And in fact, I would argue that Mason is a founder in the same way that the Anti-Federalists are founders as well. Mason's opposition to the Constitution gives zeal and life and motive power to the Anti-Federalist movement, and that is what ultimately produces the final compromise on the Constitution, which is the Bill of Rights. That was the deal that was struck, and it was struck in part because Mason, in his objections, says the first line is, "There is no Bill of Rights. Where's our Bill of Rights?" And that ends up inspiring this anti-federal movement, and ultimately the Federalists who voted 10-0 at the convention, no Bill of Rights, say, okay, we'll do a Bill of Rights. And James Madison today is championed as its author. Mason was kind of bitter about that, actually, in 1790. Was bitter. The irony of Madison being remembered as the author of the Bill of Rights. And, frankly, rightly so. But because ultimately it was Mason's efforts in 1776 and then his efforts as an anti-federalist that creates part of the Constitution, which is, arguably any other part of the Constitution, you stack it up against the Bill of Rights and say which is more important. I mean, lots of things in the Constitution are as important as the Bill of Rights, but is anything more important? I would say no. And you have to give that to Mason. And a final thought, and just to sort of bring in a theme that I'm going to try to push as we move through ratification, is that the Anti-Federalists are not the enemies of the Federalists. They're not, and we should not look at them as the bad guys. This is mostly a debate among people who share the same basic values and who disagree on how they should be expressed. And this debate ends up being a productive one. It improves the Constitution through the Bill of Rights, and also the addition of the Bill of Rights in 1789 and then ratified by 91. That creates a broad consensus in favor of the Constitution, that even as politics becomes so partisan and nasty and frankly paranoid, and everybody believes that everybody else is a foreign agent, they all still are abiding by the Constitution. I mean, the extent to which the Constitution is generally just embraced by the public is remarkable, and that would not have happened if it hadn't been for the fight of the Anti-Federalists and the acknowledgement of the Federalists. Okay, you guys have a point. Let's do Bill of Rights. And most of the Anti-Federalists are like, okay, do Bill of Rights, we're good with this thing. So just as the Anti-Federalists are, enemies of the Constitution, but are actually productive, so is Mason. And keep that in mind as we move through ratification. We're going to start looking at the process of ratification beginning in the next episode. Tonight's episode on Mason is really sort of meant as kind of an introduction, like to get our sense of like what it looks like. But keep that in mind as we move through ratification, that the Anti-Federalists are not enemies. And they shouldn't be read as the bad guys, or don't read the Anti-Federalists in the same way that you would read, say, the Loyalists in 1775 or 76. And certainly not in the same way that you would look at the Confederates during the Civil War. The Anti-Federalists are Americans, and they're committed in some way to a national union. And they're committed to the same basic principles as Madison has articulated. Their disagreement is mostly over this claim, which Mason makes, is that this Constitution is not going to advance these values. So bear that in mind as we move through and discuss ratification. So that's going to do it for tonight's episode. Join us next time. In the next episode, we're going to be looking at the process of ratification, which itself is a really dramatic and interesting story. It's going to take us some time to get through. We're going to take our time and really dig into it because it's worth it. Finally, if you haven't already, I'd ask you to consider subscribing to the podcast through your favorite streamer, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, whatever. And if you have occasion and wouldn't mind, I'd appreciate it if you took a few seconds to review and comment on the podcast. 5-star reviews are, of course, especially appreciated. And as always, they help boost the signal of the podcast, which is a good thing. So thanks for listening, everybody. And we'll see you next time with the first of several in our look at the ratification debates.